We've talked about many aspects to grief and loss, and this week we're looking at some of the theories that underpin our ideas about grief and loss, and also what is normal, what's considered a complicated grief reaction. What is grief? Grief is the normal reaction to loss, and it's a very individual experience. It's unique to each person, and there's a really wide range of normal. And our understanding of normal comes from the research and also the theorists. And a lot of what we expect people to demonstrate in their grief reactions are also influenced by culture. Right? What's considered appropriate in one culture may not be considered appropriate in another culture. And our studies of grief have primarily focused on bereavement or grief reaction related to death. And as we've already discussed, you can have grief reactions to symbolic and non death losses as well. So I'm going to go through the research. Your book does a good job providing more detail, and I'm going to add in some of my own thoughts here and as well include some journal articles for you to read on the background. When I'm talking about grief theories with organizations and individuals who may not have the background in all of the research, I try to group it into these categories because I think it's easier for people to remember. So, our earliest theories and research looked at grief as something that you could get over. And the idea behind it was you need to stop investing your energy in the people that you've lost, stop talking about them, don't remember them, move on to someone new. So I called that the forget and move on approach. Then there was a whole series of studies related to ideas about how we go through grief. And so that's the stages and phases. And then the more contemporary theories came to ideas about tasks. So William Worden looked at different different growth activities we needed to go through in order to reconcile ourselves with our losses. And then the final two, continuing bonds and dual process, those are the most current theories and models, and I'm going to talk about those. So we're going to hop in and talk about the forget and move on theories first. So the forget and move on theorists came from the work of Sigmund Freud. And so his idea was that if you experienced a death loss, in order to move forward in your life, you had to stop investing energy in the person who had died and look to invest your energy in someone new or something new. And so if you meet people who take all the pictures down when someone dies or don't talk about them, um, they may actually have had family experiences where this is how their family dealt with it. Don't talk about it, just move on. Later, there was the work of John Bowlby, and if you study developmental psychology, he was the one who talked a lot about the attachments that babies have to their caregivers. And so what he observed was that if a caregiver moved out of the baby's realm of vision, the baby did some searching. So he started to talk about loss and grief as being a reaction to the fact that this person we were attached to is no longer in our field of vision. So that's the reaction that you see. But recognize that doesn't really fall into line with why we see grief reactions with non-death losses. Then there was the work of Lindemann. There was a terrible fire that took place called Coconut Grove nightclub fire. And so all of the people who had lost loved ones in that fire, and it was a very traumatic situation, he observed had many different reactions in what he called the acute period or the early period following the death of their loved ones. And so this is where we started to see, okay, what are the physical signs and symptoms that you might see for someone who's experienced. Now let's take a look at the theorists behind the stages and phases approach to grief. A name many of you may be familiar with is Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. She was studying individuals who had been diagnosed with a terminal illness, and so they were facing or anticipating their death. she identified some stages that she saw people going through as they adjusted to this knowledge. And from that, she formed a model. And so this was called the Kubler-Ross stage model. And she said people go through these 5 stages in anticipation of their own death. Now, what happened was people took her model and said, well, this is what happens when people are grieving. They go through these 5 stages. And she said, no, that's not how I meant my model to be used. But, the world likes simple, neat, and clear models. And so this is something you still hear people talking about today. When I taught the grief and bereavement course at another university, in fact, students from one of their other programs, one of their medical programs, were still learning this theory as the approach to grief. So this is not a model to be used when you're thinking about grief, because grief is not linear. We don't go through stages. Everybody is so unique and different. And Kubler-Ross even went to the trouble of, putting on her website big explanation that please don't use this in terms of how people are going through grief. But it's too late. People do. But now you are very educated. So you know that this is not considered current knowledge in the state of grief and bereavement work. Now we're going to take a look at the more contemporary theories. So tasks and then continuing bonds and dual process. And this came from the work of William Warden. And he was a therapist. And so he started to distinguish between what was normal grief and complicated grief. And he came up with a model that had a series of tasks that the mourner had to go through. Now, he's since added additional tasks to his model, and there are many people who really are aligned with his thinking. But again, it was this notion that people had to do some work in order to move through their loss. So this is where the notion of grief work, if you ever read about that, came into play. The last two are more current. So continuing bonds was the idea that, death ended the life, but not the relationship. And this came from the work of Class, who noticed that people who were grieving, they still had a connection to the deceased. So trying to break that connection was not helpful to them. And really what they were seeing were people learning to accommodate to the loss, to renegotiate what that loss meant to them over time. And so this is where, you may hear someone who's had a loss talk about their deceased loved one. They may have pictures of them up. They may have monuments for them. And so we know that this is actually very normal behavior. So if you contrast this theory with what Freud said, don't invest energy, don't talk about the person anymore, you can see where, depending on what theory you bought into, you might have different expectations for the people around you. And certainly, if you think about a workplace, if you bought into the idea that people shouldn't talk about their loss, then you wouldn't want to hear your colleague talking about loss. The dual process model of bereavement is also very current thinking. And the idea for this one was that anyone who's grieving is actually going through a zigzag process, an oscillation they called it, between being very focused on the loss, where the grief really intrudes into their life, but also being restoration oriented, knowing that, I still have to get up and make dinner for the kids. I still have to go to work. And that they bounce back and forth between these two. And as long as they're bouncing, everything is okay. So in a workplace, what this would look like is you might see someone who seems like they're pretty good, their attention is good in the morning, but by the afternoon they're not doing as well. And so this is that movement back and forth. Here's an activity you can do right now. We've just covered these theories and ideas about grief and bereavement. Which one is closest to what you believe or used to believe? And just give that some thought and why you believe it. chances are you've been exposed to other family members who operated that way in relation to their own grief. And as we grow up, we absorb what we are experiencing and observing in the people around us. So spend a couple of minutes thinking about this. Now, I want to talk about the signs and expressions of grief or loss. And you notice I'm not calling them symptoms because grief is not an illness, right? It's a normal reaction to loss. So it is not unusual to see people demonstrating signs and expressions in the physical domain, emotional, social, and cognitive. From a workplace perspective, it is not unusual for individuals who are grieving to be struggling with forgetfulness, low thinking, having trouble focusing, time distortions. I've noticed a lot with people I've worked with where, they think I will respond to this email, this week, and then several weeks pass. Like they just lose track of time. I also want to say everybody's unique, so you may not see these, but the cognitive ones are ones that people in the workplace, they start to worry about it because they think, oh my gosh, is this going to impact my ability to do my job, and then I'll lose my job too. Certainly you see social, avoiding others, just having a lack of interest in things and finding it hard to have the same get up and go, emotional, feeling very vulnerable, like what is the meaning of all of this? And then physical, I don't think I've met anyone who's grieving who doesn't talk about struggling with their sleep being disrupted, feeling tight in the throat, tired. And, if you think about yourself, if you're just tired and not sleeping well on a regular day, that might make you a little bit crabby. The same thing's going to happen when you're grieving. Complicated grief is not something you have to know a lot about, but to recognize that there are 15 to 20% of people who may fall into this category. And someone who's dealing with complicated grief would do best to meet with a therapist and get some additional help. And so what that does say is that 80% of people are going to manage and learn how to accommodate to their loss without a therapeutic intervention. But there is a small subset of the population that doesn't move through the grief, is stuck. And so this is where therapy can be of assistance. There are some risk factors for complicated grief, and the pandemic actually has created some. So you could have multiple losses, the trauma of not being able to be with your loved one towards the end of their life, or actually being with them and seeing the terrible suffering, multiple stressors, a perceived lack of social support. So the pandemic has definitely widened the scope of who may experience complicated grief, but just to recognize that the vast majority of people will do okay. As long as they have a supportive workplace, they're going to do okay. So I'm going to conclude here by saying the things to pay attention to is just understand the history of bereavement research and the models. This discussion about what is normal, basically pretty well everything is normal because grief is such an individual reaction to loss. And think about how these concepts might apply in your work as a leader. So how does knowing all of this help you be a better leader? Okay, thanks everyone.